And I'm trying to be very brief again, and there were just a couple of things that were on my head regarding this question of soft and hard. And is that a question of consistency, or is it a question of qualities of a surface? And I mean, I like the way it was introduced in the program as something referencing the metamorphic urban planning of cities in this region, for example, them being under construction, occasionally excessive, provisional, etc. Coming from a city, Berlin, that is now going into the third consecutive decade of interim use of empty buildings for artistic purposes, I'm relatively suspicious regarding the temporary nature of all these temporary places. It could be that that the temporary, one of the qualities of the temporary is actually that as a state, the temporary never ends. You never get to the end of it. But soft and hard, I mean, I'm under the impression that what we understand naively as hard institutions, that they get softer and softer day by day. The museum is in crisis, in a way. No institution will ever rethink itself just for fun. If an institution rethinks itself, starts to rethink itself, it does so because it has to. This is not a leisure activity. But now what's the crisis of the museum? If we look at it a bit more closely, we will see that it shares many aspects of this crisis with other sites of enclosure, like the asylum that was mentioned before, the school, the hospital, the factory, the army, the prison, if you want. And this crisis articulates the fact that this age of enclosure, or if you want to mobilize Foucault, of discipline, seems to be coming to an end. We don't live that way anymore. We don't leave the factory and then enter the prison. We don't go to school and then enter the army. We are always at school, no? We are always at work, etc. So all these institutions today, these sites of enclosure, are forced to radically open. The school has to open, the museum, even, I mean, this is not a joke, even the prison has to open. Conceptually, the challenge for the prison is how do we open, because it has to. But now, towards what are these institutions opening? Towards what new era is this age of bunkers and fortresses that the museum also represents? Towards what age is it giving way? And it seems that the new model across all these fields, and we've seen it earlier today, is the corporation. Or if you look more closely, you could make out that it's actually not just the corporation, it's more like the bank or the financial service company as a model. So what we're looking at is an era of networking, of risk-taking, of tracking, tracing, or essentially, if we want to follow Gilles Deleuze, of control. Now, what's the paradigm of control? Just as the state realizes it knows nothing about its citizens, the museum realizes it knows nothing about its audiences. I mean, you see this sheet that you have on your... I mean, of course, this is one of the challenges, like who are these audiences? What do they want? The museum doesn't even know where the audiences are. I mean, you could be anywhere. I mean, there's some, as Shaina has pointed out, but in the end, the visitors could be anywhere, and the museum does not even know. And we've seen a couple of graphics before of these first attempts to actually trace or optimize. But I think for now, trace the pathways of visitors in the museum. And the fact that the museum does not even know about the whereabouts of its visitors, that has to change. The museum has to rethink its audiences as a gas. This is the model, I think. As a substance that consists of of particles that can be further separated and that need to be controlled. And controlled just means you have to measure the distribution of visitors in time, as we've seen also, in space. You have to find certain patterns, if you can, regularities, but also outliers and irregularities in these patterns. And then thirdly, to develop procedures to influence the distribution of particles. That would be building audiences. But first and foremost, you have to read them. I mean, this form is just it's just a surface phenomenon. It goes a bit deeper than that. You have to measure them, you have to locate them. In the logic of control, the audience to the museum is information. What the audience does to the museum is it brings in information. And it brings in information for free, or even pays for it. So in that sense, it's kind of no longer economically valid to not capture, read, and store and interpret that information. So that's one of the paradigms, the corporation, the bank, this kind of entity. I've once heard a presentation of a head of an art school in the Netherlands who promoted the concept of her art school as the art school as train station, another model, the hub, this kind of node within a network. And I think it was well-intentioned, like, okay, it's a place where people meet, where people come together and leave again, and there's some temporality in it. But if you think of a place, of a train station as a place of education, it's hard to come up with something more horrible as a place for study, a place where you, it's complete, I mean, you've been to train stations. Or to airports, for what it's worth, so the hub. And while rethinking itself, I think what also shifts is the neighbors of, or the neighboring fields of the museum. No? It's education, because education is, for reasons that are a bit beyond the scope of this excursion, in a very weak state. As a field, even in a bigger crisis then. And then obviously sports. I mean, we're in Doha, it's probably also a place where we can make a short excursion to sports. I mean, in these lists of top 10 exhibitions we've seen, there's one pattern I can make out. It has the same distribution of, there's always a top 5, there's always big 5, big 6. In all these fields, in the economy, in sports, and also in the museums. Like Tate and Guggenheim and MoMA and Centre Pompidou, they're like Man U and Real and Barca and Milan. They always have to be 4 or 5 or 6, and it's very important there's no dominance, but this is the distribution. It's about this structure of the big 5. And then you have to see to what extent you can draw inspiration from sports, like, will a new generation of artists be modeled after athletes? Which means you have to, I mean, strangely enough, the artist less and less has to physically give his or her health into the process of producing art, less and less so that would be a distinction to the sports person. But this idea that the career is short and you have certain time spans and then there's certain modes of transition, is the curator a figure that's kind of modeled now after the coach, someone who's mostly a manager or a bit of a manager, a bit of an expert, a bit of a, like, how do you, but these fields stick together. I mean, it would not be necessary to introduce, like, for example, an exhibition of Damien Hirst taking place at the same time as the Olympics. You wouldn't even have to, I mean, obviously, when you have the Olympics, you have to, these systems and the structures in these systems are similar. And then I think the question is, in the end, like, when we present Padma, what do we do? Like, does it relate? Is it something that's different? Is it something that is in an oppositional stance? Is it something that's just something else? Is it something that communicates? Are these activities that, what's the situation? Where does it begin from? Is there any hope in, like, ethics of abstinence? Is there an outside of these systems? Are there different approaches? Are there parasitical approaches that could be interesting? And what are the times where you have to resist? What are the times where you have to ignore, which are very distinct modes? And yeah, how do you work? Despite, or this could be like one of the discussions I mean, it's a discussion that we've been involved in for the last 3 years together and much longer individually. But it's a different set of problems than the ones we've talked about in the morning. But yeah, they have to be explored a bit deeper, I think.
So hopefully, what Sebastian's saying I mean, that the idea of our game now just extends. You know, can all these forces play with each other, and can there be more ways of softening things and interacting and winning? No, I'm done. It was just the last diagram and kind of ties up with what Sebastian was saying in the end. Who do we face? How do we face? And what kind of, how do the material properties, for example, of film in the archive now open up to all these kinds of many forces that can then now play with each other? The act of opening then is kind of important.